speakers here this weekend. I'm probably the least important, so I am probably the most honored to be here. I'm very happy to be here. Driving in last night to see Stone Mountain, I wondered why I don't come here more often. It truly is beautiful, and I personally look forward to taking advantage of the setting more often. My talk tonight is on Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., and I'll be citing things throughout the piece, and I'll try to remember to indicate when I'm citing something. Occasionally I have lines that just sort of roll into quotations, and I'll try to remember to pause and note when I am quoting somebody. But let me begin by saying what this talk is not and does not do. This talk is not an endorsement of the political views and jurisprudence of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., whatever those might have been. This talk is not a celebration of Holmes's life and worldview. This talk is not an apology for Holmes's metaphysics, epistemology, or pragmatism. This talk does not suggest that Holmes was pro-Confederate or that he hoped the Union would dissolve. Nor does this talk suggest that Holmes's notions about life, law, and politics were fixed or reliable or even easily discernible. Rather, this talk is narrow in scope and focuses specifically on Holmes's views about Lincoln, the Union, and the war. These views changed over time as Holmes matured, grew disenchanted with the ideology of unionism, and liberated his thinking from the misguided zeal and habits of thinking that too often accompany youth. As a young man, Holmes was an idealist of the Emersonian variety, and he associated with such abolitionists as Wendell Phillips, for whom Holmes, still a student at Harvard, served as a bodyguard one evening. Phillips is an interesting figure in his own right. Dr. Livingston mentioned Phillips momentarily last evening. Of the compact states of North and South, Phillips once said, "To continue this disastrous alliance longer is madness. The trial of 50 years only proves it impossible for free and slave states to unite on any terms." Phillips also referred to Lincoln as a more unlimited despot than the world knows this side of China. Holmes and Phillips may not have seen eye to eye, but Holmes gradually saw the logic of a system of government rooted in region and locality instead of in a centralized power operating to subsume disparate cultural practices and traditions under a single national standard. A few preliminary words are in order concerning Holmes's beliefs, in particular his eventual beliefs in unbelief. That is because Holmes, once dubbed the Yankee of Olympus, will strike some of you as an unusual figure to be addressing this evening. Holmes has always been an elusive man because he has been so misunderstood by even the greatest legal minds, and few philosophers outside the legal academy have taken the time to seriously consider Holmes's idiosyncratic thought. Many commentators mistakenly refer to Holmes as a progressive, and some mistakenly refer to him as a conservative. Really, Holmes was a pragmatist. He was not interested in political causes as much as he was interested in methods and ways of thinking. The war between the states left its mark on him and pushed him in the direction of pragmatism because it demonstrated to him that imposition of force by one society or group upon another can result in mass uncertainty and unnecessary death. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Metaphysical Club, William Anand explains that the lesson Holmes took from the war can be put in a sentence. It is that certitude leads to violence. This was the idea that drove Holmes to distrust Lincoln and the Republicans and to disassociate from any radicals he knew before enlisting in the Army. Holmes did not appreciate those who were cocksure about the aims and causes of the war because Holmes himself came to believe that what people said the war was about was not, in fact, what the war was about. Most of the troops he knew wanted nothing to do with the ideals of the abolitionists, nor, for that matter, were they enthralled with Lincoln and the Republicans. Captain William F. Bartlett, who served alongside Holmes, had written in his diary before the first day of battle that, "The battalion has not been ordered out yet. I don't know what I shall do if it is. It would be fighting rather against my principles, since I have stuck up for the South all along." The mystery of Holmes and many men in his regiment is how they could fight for the Union Army despite their disdain for Lincoln, their respect for the Southern cause and the Southern soldier, and their revulsion at the idea that Southern slaves should be set upon equal political footing with Southern whites. I have reached no conclusion myself about these motivations. The mindset of these mid-19th century Northern men is just too alien to me for total comprehension. So I'll defer here to Holmes's earliest biographer, who says that the regulars did not serve in order that they might contribute to the achievements of certain defined objectives, whether political or humane, but because they were professional soldiers who had chosen the career of arms. This biographer assures us that it is not surprising that young men who joined the Union forces as volunteers without a burning hatred of slavery, without confidence in Lincoln, and uncertain whether or not secession was lawful, should make the standards of the professional soldier their own. In quoting this line, I don't mean to impute the purposes of others to Holmes, but to suggest that Holmes was surrounded by men whose views about the war between the states probably impacted him to varying degrees. Gary Gallagher, a historian, has recently pointed out in his book, The Union War, that many, if not most, of the Union soldiers fought on behalf of an ideology of unionism rather than race or slavery. But a few soldiers fought in pursuit of a soldierly career, or even in a few of them out of a sense of sheer duty. A sense of duty or obligation is likely what led many young men in Holmes's regiment to enter the war, and also that led them to respect and admire the Confederates, whose soldiers were courageous in battle and whose generals were heroic in stature and reputation. According to Gallagher, few Union soldiers cared if Southern slaves remained in bondage, and Holmes was no exception. Even if it is hard to say what led Holmes to fight, it is easy to say that he later regretted the war and the preventable carnage that it brought about. The longer he was in the war, explains one biographer, the more he was convinced that not death was the horror, but the loss of a young man's chance to live. Never to have your chance, never to show the world, to show yourself what you could do. After the war, Holmes was a changed man. He never again wanted to be part of a movement that sought to compel one culture to conform to another, or to transform by force the traditions and institutions of a different place with different allegiances, priorities, and ways of living and thinking. Holmes joined the 20th Massachusetts, which was by no means abolitionist or even Republican. That's a quote from Louis Menand. Nor were his Harvard classmates and faculty, whom he left behind, supportive of Lincoln. Far from it. President Felton supported slavery, as did mathematics professor Benjamin Peirce, who maintained ties with Southern planters and whose children had enlisted at Harvard. Many of Holmes's comrades in the 20th despised the abolitionists and thought that the war was a mistake. The leader of the regiment, General Stone, had, after the battle at Ball's Bluff, ordered his men to collect the escaped slaves who had sought safety with the Union Army and to return those slaves to their masters. Menand explains that Holmes, like other members of his regiment, had little respect for Lincoln, and that this was a common enough Northern attitude early in the war. Some Northerners considered Lincoln incompetent and without a plan, and some considered him an extremist, so much so that Holmes once recalled a conversation in the trenches with some of his Harvard classmates about whether the war had produced a great man. Someone timidly suggested Lincoln, and the others laughed him down. Holmes's closest friend in the regiment was Henry Abbott. If there was such a thing as a Copperhead, Abbott was that. He has been called Abbott the Copperhead, as well as a man who didn't even believe in the goals of the war, yet died for them. He was an open admirer of General McClellan as against Lincoln, a vocal critic of the Lincoln administration, a Southern sympathizer, and a staunch Democrat. When he heard that Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Abbott wrote in a letter that the President's proclamation is of course received with universal disgust, particularly the part which enjoins the officers to see that it is carried out. You may be sure that we shan't see to any such thing of the kind, having decidedly too much reverence for the Constitution. Abbott's father, Josiah, also protested against the Emancipation Proclamation by helping to organize the People's Convention, a group devoted to unseating the Massachusetts governor, a Republican, from office. Abbott and men like him were worried about Lincoln's treatment of and disregard for the U.S. Constitution. Mark DeWolf Howe, he was a man that eventually was a law clerk for Justice Holmes, wrote in his biography of Holmes that it was not surprising that Union officers did not look upon Lincoln as a great and heroic figure in the war. After all, Lincoln had, against their wishes, unseated General McClellan and issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which appalled many soldiers who had sworn loyalty to the Constitution and who had not considered slavery to be their sole purpose in fighting. Holmes himself suggested that the Union Army was only willing to trust its life and reputation to one man, General McClellan. Holmes was not willing to put his life in the hands of Lincoln. Nearly every biography of Holmes tells the following story about Holmes and Lincoln, while conceding that the details are probably more legend than fact. Lincoln is said to have stood up on a parapet during his visit to Fort Stevens to secure a panoramic view of the battlefield. All of a sudden, Confederate bullets began to spray into the Union lines. Young Holmes, then a captain, alarmed by the idiocy of the tall, gaunt man who seemed not to know what to do in the heat of battle, hollered, "Get down, you damn fool, before you get shot," at which point the President of the United States got down. Some accounts maintain that Holmes did not know he was speaking to the President. Others maintained that Holmes knew damn well that he was speaking to the President and that that was precisely the point. As Howell puts it, the Captain Holmes seems to have treated the commander-in-chief with some impetuosity and in doing so, incidentally, to have expressed the conviction that the fighting of wars was something more serious than a spectacle produced for the benefit of civilians. Last night, Dr. Livingston read from Dr. Clyde Wilson's paper, which discussed myth at length. And a couple of years ago, here at a meeting for the Philadelphia Society in Atlanta, I had the privilege of hearing the late Tom Landis speak about myth. And Dr. Landis defined myth as a commonly held belief of a people that helps them define themselves to themselves and to others. So it's worth asking, if this story about Lincoln is a myth, why Northerners and Southerners alike continue to retell the story about Holmes and Lincoln that, in its rendering of the president as an ignorant bystander with no sense of leadership, common sense, or bravery, sustains what would seem to be an important challenge, or perhaps counter-myth, to the myth of Lincoln as a wise and courageous and principled leader. Later in life, Holmes would at times contradict himself on Lincoln's, writing favorably of the 16th president, for instance, in letters to Harold J. Lasky, but Holmes appears to have remained decidedly opposed to Lincoln's leadership and skeptical of Lincoln's reputation. His ideas about Lincoln, if they could ever have been called favorable, represented an acquiescence to the prevailing currents of public opinion. "Until I was middle-aged," Holmes wrote in a 1926 letter to Albert J. Beveridge, "I never doubted that I was witnessing the growth of a myth. Then the revelation of some facts and the greatness of some of his speeches, helped perhaps by the environing conviction of the later world, led me to accept the popular judgment, which I do, but without a great deal of ardor or a very great interest in the man." In other words, Holmes came to agree that Lincoln was a brilliant rhetorician, but Holmes found it difficult to get excited about Lincoln the man. Holmes did not buy into Lincoln the myth. Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the father of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., was a unionist. He and Emerson had a falling out of sorts when Emerson discovered that Holmes had been criticizing the abolitionists for threatening to sever the United States into factions and multiple governments. Holmes Jr. did not agree with his father about preserving the alleged integrity and coercive uniformity of the nation. He did, however, agree with his father in thinking that slavery was only an ancillary issue dividing the North and the South. When Holmes dropped out of Harvard to enlist in the Union Army, he did so, in part, I suspect, to rebel against his father, who wanted his son to finish school, and in part to rebel against the Harvard authorities, whom Holmes considered stuffy, pedantic, and self-important, and who had clashed with the insubordinate Holmes on several occasions. Freeing the slaves hardly crossed Holmes's mind, and preserving the Union struck Holmes as quixotic and dangerous. Why exactly Holmes enlisted, in light of his ambivalence about the war, remains unclear, but his reasons must have pertained to forces not totally under his control, the time and space in which he, through no fault or agency of his own, was situated. He himself once declared that he had been forced to share the passion and action of his time at peril of being judged not to have lived. The last thing Holmes was fighting for was racial equality or any such racial purpose. Holmes was rather open in his belief that Negro soldiers were a disgrace. When asked in 1863 to join a black regiment, Holmes, offended, refused. He and most of the fellow soldiers in the 20th Massachusetts were not interested in bettering the relations between whites and blacks, and they might have dropped their weapons and returned home had they been informed that the cause they were fighting for was the emancipation of black slaves. After learning of Holmes's decision not to join the black regiment, but instead to rejoin the 20th Massachusetts, Abbott wrote Holmes to say, "I haven't time to tell you how much I am delighted at your decision to stick to the old mother," adding, "I believe you have done not only what is proper, instead of absurdly wasting yourself before the shrine of the great inward." This comment signals a growing animosity within Holmes's regiment towards those soldiers in other regiments who had started to suggest that the causes of the war might have included racial issues. For Abbott as for Holmes, race did not play a role in the decision to join or to remain in the war effort, and neither man wanted to think that he was fighting on behalf of a race that he felt vastly superior to. To have fought for slaves would have seemed degrading to Holmes's and Abbott's personal sense of valor and honor. These were the men, after all, who were seeking to return the runaway slaves back to their southern masters at the close of battle after having used these slaves to fight on their behalf. Now, let me be clear. Don't misunderstand me. This is not to condone Holmes or Abbott's views on race, but to suggest that contemporary understandings of the racial motivations of soldiers like Holmes and Abbott have been distorted by recycled cliches and stereotypes, as well as by general misunderstanding. In truth, Holmes's regiment was filled with self-proclaimed Copperheads toward whom Holmes gravitated because they made gallantry their ideal and cared little for any moral cause for which they could have been fighting. And this is a quote from one of Holmes's biographers. Holmes's personal affection for the Copperheads Henry Abbott and Charles Whittier must have been founded on some basic sympathy. And of all the soldiers Holmes fought alongside, the Copperheads Abbott and Whittier earned his most praise. Even as the Northern War effort gained successes and momentum, Holmes and his companions were becoming increasingly disenchanted with the ideology of unionism that had once carried such purchase. In the fall of 1863, Whittier, who served with Holmes in the 20th and later in the 6th Corps headquarters, wrote that we have but two parties, Union, which consists of Republicans, contractors, and liberal generals promoted for merit, and Copperheads, Democrats, opposers of the war, all McClellan men, commanders of departments like Schneck, Milroy, and Fremont, and many others whose recommendations for promotion in high places like in military ability. I am, Whittier said, a Copperhead. It was not just a disenchantment with unionism that was the problem. It was that the war was taking on new meaning in many places in the North, and that the justification for the war was being couched in new vocabularies and rhetoric. Holmes, along with many of his fellow soldiers, did not think he owed a duty to defend the ideals and causes that were now being put forth as among the reasons for the war. Shortly before Holmes quit the service altogether, he wrote that, I have felt for some time that I didn't any longer believe in this being a duty, and so I mean to leave. Even more pointedly, he wrote that I was not demoralized when I announced my intention to leave the service next winter if I lived so long. I started this thing as a boy. I am now a man, and I have been coming to the conclusion for the last 6 months that my duty has changed. I can do no disagreeable thing or face a great danger coolly enough when I know it is my duty, but a doubt demoralizes me as it does any nervous man, and now I honestly think the duty of fighting has ceased for me. Before the war, Holmes had been a poet and an idealist. After the war, he turned from those Emersonian fancies and pursuits to the more hard and mechanical instruments and technicalities of the law. The wartime disillusionment Holmes experienced had something to do with his association with Copperheads, and it led him to fall into skepticism and away from transcendentalism. Holmes feared and deplored avoidable death, and the war left him bitter towards any ideology attempting to validate the takeover and destruction of a cultural, intellectual, and political rival. Menand opens the Metaphysical Club by saying, Holmes hated the war, and Menand later says that Holmes considered the war a hideous human waste. There were several reasons for Holmes's antipathy toward the war effort, the most notable of which was his abhorrence of the carnage and killing that he witnessed firsthand. He also could not understand why so many of his parents' generation despised Southerners, especially Southern soldiers, whom he had grown to respect enormously. In 1862, he wrote that, I've pretty much made up my mind that the South have achieved their independence, and I am almost ready to hope spring will see an end. And he remarked, too, that I think before long, the majority will say that we are vainly working to effect what never happens, the subjugation, for that is what it is, of a great civilized nation. We shan't do it. At least the Union Army can't. This great civilized nation was the South, the Confederacy. Of the South, Holmes, still a soldier, wrote to his father, referring to some conviction that his father shared with a historian named John Lothrop Motley, that I don't think either of you realize the unity or determination of the South. I think you are hopeful because, excuse me, you are ignorant. Holmes goes on to say that we may be sure and will stand a better chance in the proper province peace than in war, the brother of slavery. Brother, it is slavery's parent, child, and sustainer at once. Holmes here makes clear that he viewed war as, if not worse than slavery, then at least on par with it. War is more than the brother of slavery, he says. It is the parent, child, and sustainer of slavery. The irony, as Holmes seems to imply, is that some Northerners decried slavery in the South even as the Union Army sought to enslave Southerners. That's a big claim, but it's one that Holmes was on the verge of making. Holmes first enlisted in the infantry before he joined the 20th Massachusetts, a regiment that lost 5/8 of its men. Before completing his training with the 20th, Holmes was made a first lieutenant. He was wounded at the Battle of Ball's Bluff in October 1861 when he took a bullet to his chest. The bullet passed through his body without touching his heart or his lungs. In September of 1862, Holmes, now a captain, was wounded at the Battle of Antietam, a bullet having passed through his neck. In May of 1863, at Mary's Hill, close to where the Battle of Fredericksburg had taken place 6 months earlier, Holmes was shot and wounded a third time, a bullet having struck him in the heel, splintering his bone and tearing his ligaments so that his doctors were convinced he would lose his leg. Holmes never lost the leg, but he limped for the rest of his life. Once Holmes became a soldier, he despised bloodshed on account of a cause he could not identify, and so could not identify with. Eventually, the war for him was a lot of fighting over nothing. At least over nothing clear-cut or certain. Nobody was able to convince him of the reasons for the war, and he grew to believe that there were no definite causes and that the Republicans were going to great lengths to try to find a legitimizing narrative of war that the ingenuous Northern public would both respect and believe. One biographer describes the trajectory of Holmes's war experience this way. It had begun for him as a buoyant crusade, quickly became a reminder of his own mortality with Ball's Bluff, evolved into a dispiriting quagmire with the Pennsylvania campaign, and became a source of sardonic humor after Antietam. By Fredericksburg, Holmes was undoubtedly relieved not to be participating. The war and all the arguments in support of it gradually lost their allure for Holmes, and he eventually gave up on them entirely. He dismissed all putative reasons for the cause of the war and lamented the many deaths of his friends and even the many deaths of his enemies. Holmes never went back on his admiration for the skills and bravery of the Southern soldier. In fact, he treated both Northern and Southern soldiers as being in a class of their own, apart from the bureaucrats and politicians and the privileged sons of privileged people like William James, who had avoided the war. Holmes and James had a complicated relationship. They courted the same woman, Fanny Dixwell. Holmes won out because, Holmes was a tall, debonair man with a nice mustache, and William James was sort of manic depressant. And so Holmes won out that battle, and I don't think he had too much difficulty doing so. He was something of a flirt. But Holmes looked down on people like James who didn't fight. And Holmes believed that the Union soldier and the Confederate soldier understood each other in a way that was not possible for those who did not participate in the conflict. Consider the following commentary by Holmes. The soldiers who were doing their very best to kill one another felt less of personal hostility, I am very certain, than some who were not imperiled by their mutual endeavors. I have heard more than one of those who had been gallant and distinguished officers on the Confederate side say that they had no such feeling. I know that I and those whom I knew best had not. We believed that it was most desirable that the North should win, and they basically, summarizing, believed that it was most desirable that the South should win. We equally believed that those who stood against us held just as sacred convictions that were the opposite of ours, and we respected them as every man with a heart must respect those who give all for their belief. The experience of battle soon taught its lesson even to those who came into the field more bitterly disposed. You could not stand up day after day in those indecisive contests where the overwhelming victory was impossible because neither side would run as they ought to when beaten, without getting at last something of the same brotherhood for the enemy that the North Pole of the magnet has for the South. As it was then, it is now. This is Holmes writing many years later. The soldiers of the war need no explanations. They can join in commemorating a soldier's death with the feelings not different in kind, whether he fell toward them or by their side, whether that is he was Union or Confederate. Although Holmes rather dishonestly mentions unionism as a reason that he himself went to war later in his life, and although he suggests that slavery was an important issue for Northern soldiers, both claims he never would have made early in his life, he takes pains to portray soldiers, both Union and Confederate, as sharing in a fraternal bond. Nevertheless, Holmes's war had few heroes, and Holmes made no pretensions to heroism himself, just as there is nothing particularly heroic about his letters. Scores of potential biographers in the 1990s, when all kinds of new, previously unreleased papers about Holmes were released, were disappointed to discover that Holmes was not the type of person who could be made into a war hero, a champion of racial equality and progress, or a supporter of Lincoln. They had been hoping, one presumes, to find that Holmes was instead a hater of Southerners, a partisan of Lincoln's unionism, and a supporter of Northern aggression. Many of these potential biographers abandoned their projects on Holmes when they realized that the man who was wounded 3 times during the war nevertheless did not hold grudges nor stick to any of the conventions that some historians have assigned to other Northern figures of the time. As an adult, which is what the war made him, Holmes befriended former Confederates with whom he dined on several occasions. He wrote to Canon Patrick Augustine Sheehan of his old friend, the Confederate officer, and he wrote of our brethren of the South. He believed that the greatest soldiers of the Union and the Confederacy shared a bond in manliness. The greatest qualities, he once said, are those of a man. and neither North nor South needed colleges to learn those. For someone who was critically wounded by Confederates, not just once but 3 times, Holmes has surprisingly little to say about Confederate soldiers, especially little bad to say, if anything at all. In fact, Holmes spoke of Confederates mostly in tones of awe and approval. Maybe that's because Holmes believed that both Union and Confederate soldiers, as he put it in an address in 1884, felt so deeply that a man ought to take part in the war unless some conscientious scruple or strong practical reason made it impossible. He made sure to add that, "I think this feeling was right, in the South as in the North." Holmes is mostly known for his life after the war, for his career as a judge, first on the Massachusetts Supreme Court, later on the Supreme Court of the United States. But this older Holmes was always defined by his experiences as a young soldier. Most academics outside the legal academy consider Holmes to be a champion of progressivism, but he wasn't. And some commentators have referred to Holmes as a conservative, but that's not right either. Richard Posner, he's a University of Chicago law professor, a judge on the Seventh Circuit, says this about Holmes. Holmes's reputation has fluctuated with political fashion, though never enough to dim his renown. Although many of his opinions took the liberal side of issues, the publication of his correspondence revealed what should have been, but was not apparent from his judicial opinions and occasional speeches, that so far as his personal views were concerned, he was liberal only in the 19th century libertarian sense, the sense of John Stuart Mill and, even more, because more laissez-faire, of Herbert Spencer. He was not a New Deal welfare state liberal, and he thought the social experiments that he conceived it to be his judicial duty to uphold were manifestations of envy and ignorance and were doomed to fail. Hostile to antitrust policy, skeptical about unions, admiring of big businessmen, Holmes was a lifelong rock-ribbed Republican who did not balk even at Warren Harding. Now, I think Posner is grossly exaggerating here. I do not think that Oliver Wendell Holmes was the classical liberal that Posner's making him out to be. Turns out Posner is not either. Posner, an elected member of the Mount Pelerin Society, came out with a book in 2008 called The Failure of Capitalism. So Holmes is really neither conservative, as some biographers like Max Lerner have called him, and he was not quite progressive either. In a way, all labels missed the mark for Holmes. He floated outside labels. He defied categorization, which is sometimes a lazy way of affixing a name to something to avoid considering the complexity and nuances and even contradictions inherent in that something. Holmes's position regarding the 14th Amendment, which this is one of the Civil War amendments. It says a lot of things, but specifically granting citizenship to the former slaves. But Holmes was very concerned about the 14th Amendment and the broad interpretations it was getting at the expense of the states. He put it best in his dissent in Troe v. Corrigan, "There is nothing that I deprecate more than the use of the 14th Amendment beyond the absolute compulsion of its words to prevent the making of social experiments that an important part of the community desires in the insulated chambers afforded by the several states." As he put it elsewhere, this is even more to the point. "I have not yet adequately expressed the more than anxiety I feel at the ever-increasing scope given to the 14th Amendment and writing down what I believe to be the constitutional rights of the states." Now, I have many close friends who interpret the 14th Amendment in a way that would have not pleased Holmes, and many of these folks consider themselves political libertarians, as do I, although we come down on very different places on the 14th Amendment. I personally think that Holmes has it right with the 14th Amendment. Holmes, in his rhetoric about the 14th Amendment, suggests that he would leave most matters to the states and their legislators to decide. His judicial practice of leaving local legislatures alone came most probably from his conviction that moral and cultural imperialism were rarely justified and could often lead to unnecessary violence. Holmes was not a relativist. He simply thought that his position on the Supreme Court did not give him license to prescribe moral beliefs for the rest of the country. This view is one I suspect he picked up during the war between the states when he saw and came to appreciate the Confederates' commitment to their cause and willingness to die for their region, family, and way of life. Holmes, the soldier, began to wonder why it was that those on the other side could hold so steadfast to their view of the war, and how they could die for their views, and how the Northerner could call any such Southerners immoral or wrong. Was it not just that the Southerners' cultures, customs, and institutions were different? Was it not wrong to, in effect, colonize the South for whatever reason, be it industrial interests or imposition of taxes and tariffs? Justice Holmes assumed that a judge should not impose his personal ideology onto a populace. He believed that, in general, a state legislature knew better than a federal judge, let alone a Supreme Court justice, what was best for the local community. A common mistake is to take Holmes's deference to the mores and traditions of states and localities as evidence of his shared belief in his mores and traditions. The prime example of this is the Lochner v. New York case, where people cast Holmes as a more or less a critic of capitalism and a supporter of regulations of industry. What Holmes was ruling in that case was basically that the interpretation of the Fourth Amendment shouldn't be so expansive that a federal judge, that a Supreme Court justice, one person, a group of 9 people, should be able to dictate terms to New York about their policy. If New York wanted to regulate business in that way, that was New York's business, but not the Supreme Court's. Holmes did not have to agree with states and localities to say that federal judges and Supreme Court justices should not inject their worldview into the life of a community with a different worldview. Holmes's position on judging is analogous, I think, this is just a personal opinion, to William James's suggestion in Varieties of Religious Experience that a person is entitled to believe what he wants so long as the practice of his religious beliefs cannot be disproven and does not infringe upon the religious practices of others. The progressive reading is that Holmes's deference to state legislators may have had something to do with the majoritarianism of John Dewey, and the conservative reading is that it may have had something to do with his hesitance to encroach upon the sovereignty of localities. Either way, Holmes resisted the temptation to command faraway people on the grounds of rights and liberties about which there was much disagreement. His jurisprudence was one of restraint. I cannot emphasize enough that I do not consider myself in agreement with Holmes about many things, but I do recognize and appreciate his consistent reluctance to interfere with state law and local political matters. Few have speculated that Holmes's position toward state legislatures may have had something to do with his witnessing firsthand the wartime consequences of federal impositions upon resistant localities. But in light of the aforesaid, how could people not acknowledge the influence of the war upon Holmes's judicial outlook? How could people not at least see that Holmes's rejection of attempts to, quote, reconstruct society, as he put it in the Northern Securities case, which criticized, this is another case, this criticized an expansive interpretation of federal power, but this time under the Commerce Clause. But how could people not, with Holmes using words like resisting the attempts to reconstruct society, have read that as something that would have resonated in light of the Reconstruction era and all of its political and cultural transformation projects? Holmes is a tough figure to pin down. His actions often don't align with his purported ideas to the extent that his ideas are discernible and knowable at all. One thing about him is certain. His life was forever marked by the war between the states. I do not know what "What is true?" he once wrote. "I do not know the meaning of the universe. But in the midst of doubt, in the collapse of creed, there is one thing I do not doubt, that no man who lives in the same world with most of us can doubt. And that is that the faith is true and adorable which leads a soldier to throw away his life in obedience to a blindly accepted duty, in a cause which he little understands, and a plan of campaign of which he has no notion, under tactics of which he does not see." Now here Holmes is getting a little, he is speaking in tones of admiration of death in sort of in an odd way. But I think he may well have been speaking for many of the Union soldiers who had little in common with Lincoln and the Republicans, and who cared little whether the South seceded from the Union, and who had no ambition to liberate slaves or even to stop the spread of slavery westward. And Holmes's Union regiment, the 20th Massachusetts, was sort of a representative case of that. And I believe that it was in that regiment where Holmes's worldviews were shaped, where they took place, and where his judicial philosophy developed. Thank you very much.